Hello, I'm Michael Strong, the founder of ExpanseOnline.co. My latest in a long series of schools. This one is a virtual middle school. In the past, I've done high schools, middle schools, mostly private, some one charter, and then I worked in public education for quite a long time prior to that. I'm the author of The Habit of Thought, From Socratic Seminars to Socratic Practice, and I've spent the last 35 years introducing Socratic education, Socratic seminars, Socratic practice in a very wide range of classrooms. I want to show, though, a couple of experiences with Alana, a young woman I've been having Socratic dialogues with, and then we're going to go and look at actual public school curricula. We'll look at samples from the 3 best online public schools of Texas, so you can get a concrete sense of what the reality of schooling is for most kids. But let's first start by looking at Alana, listening to her, not just looking at her. This is Alana when she was 4. Let me get to her. And a little conversation I had with her.
Really? So I have a question. Are you ready to start with questions?
Yes.
So I always think about things. So when you say a puzzle, I immediately think, what is a puzzle? Does that seem like a weird question?
Yes.
Do you mind weird questions?
Yes.
You do mind. It means you don't want me to ask you weird questions?
I do.
Okay. So tell me what a puzzle is. How do we know if something is a puzzle? How do we know whether or not something is a puzzle? Are Legos a puzzle?
No.
Why not?
But we can build stuff on it.
Could you build a puzzle out of Legos?
No. Yes.
No or yes? Are you thinking about it? Maybe both?
Yes.
Okay. So let me think about other examples of things that might be puzzles. Is a book a puzzle?
Yes.
What makes a book into a puzzle?
Like when you read.
So reading is a puzzle?
Yes.
Okay. How about eating lunch? Is eating lunch a puzzle?
That's a funny one.
So I'll pause there for a minute. A couple of things. One is Viggo Mortensen in Captain Fantastic is over the top intense. For those of you who've seen the movie, some pretty harsh things happen. So I don't necessarily see his form of homeschooling as an entirely positive thing by any means. So one of the reasons to give you an example of my interactions with Alana is to show how natural and fun and positive and casual it can be to do intellectual dialogue with kids. Many people think of intellectual dialogue as this heavy thing, but it can be easy and fun. A very specific note I want to make here is that from the very earliest, here she is 4 years old, I want her to learn to think for herself. That is, rather than being a didactic instructor where I am trying to get her to have a right answer necessarily, I just open-ended ask what a puzzle is. And, can Legos be a puzzle? For me, it's an interesting question. I'm sure one could make puzzles out of Legos. Are books a puzzle? In a certain sense, some books very much are a puzzle. I don't know if that's what she meant or not. That's okay. Is eating lunch a puzzle? That's when I got her to the point of, that's a funny one. She knows it's not a puzzle. And so this is where she begins to develop her own understanding, and she's evaluating. Those who know Bloom's taxonomy know that evaluation judgment is the highest level. Here she is at 4, trying to figure these things out on her own. So critical to my interaction with children of all ages, high school seniors or adults, but also 3 years old, 4 years old, is getting them to think for themselves and putting them in an environment where they are thinking for themselves. Now let's look briefly at Alana at age 8 to see how she is doing things a bit differently at that point. Let's see. Here we go. This is going to be Alana at age 8. She's comparing Roald Dahl and C.S. Lewis here.
So maybe let's think about C.S. Lewis versus Roald Dahl. In what ways are those two authors similar? And in what ways are they different?
I think they both write like fantasy and stuff. For example, like Charlie and the Chocolate Factory. I would think that's fantasy because I don't think anyone invented or can invent ice cream for really, really, really cold days, or gum that gives you a full course meal. I don't think anyone can invent that, but maybe. So to me, that's kind of fantasy. Mm-hmm. And C.S. Lewis also writes about fantasy, like where animals can talk, other lands, and stuff like that.
Okay, so that's the similarity. And then what are the differences?
Maybe Roald Dahl writes a little bit more about like the real world, because like in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory, it's actually in London or England, I forget which one, and it's actually a chocolate factory. There are chocolate factories in this world. Yeah, I think he writes about that, and then C.S. Lewis kind of writes about, I think, a little more fantasy, because it's not actually on Earth, it's in different worlds, and there's talking animals, and animals don't talk here. There's no caraval on Earth. I don't think so, at least. Mm-hmm.
So what I want to point out there is, first of all, how amazingly articulate and thoughtful she is. Of course, her parents deserve much of the credit for interacting with her constantly. And I've been, especially with her father, talking about Socratic dialogue and getting her to think for herself. She is, I think, a nice counterpoint to the young blonde girl in the Captain Fantastic film. She's a real kid, and she's not kind of coming across, for me, the blonde girl comes across a little bit rigid, and that whole situation is a bit rigid. Alana is natural and thoughtful. And I would say in many ways, she's exceeding the performance of many middle and some high school children with respect to the style of thought she does, even if she's still a young child and has many skills to develop. I'm going to just glance briefly at what some examples of high school curricula are, so you get a sense for what people are doing out there. So this one, I'm going to look at the three top-ranked virtual high schools in Texas. This one, Connections Academy, Aztec Creation Story. So basically this is a textbook online, language arts textbook online. You see the objectives: analyze characters in a myth, name the elements of a creation story, identify and use nouns correctly, keywords, blah, blah, blah. Those two suburban boys, they're going to read this, they're interested in sports, they're interested in, all sorts of fun things they do with their friends. They come to this, they don't care. They don't care at all. It's meaningless. It's perfectly relevant to their life. I was good at what I call memorize and forget stories. If you look at this stuff, go to another slide. Eventually there's going to be a quiz, and at the quiz, some of us memorize and forget it, some of us ignore it. But I don't think this is meaningful to most students. And I'm not criticizing the education curriculum designers. This is what language class is. Let's quickly look at another example. This one is K-12 education. And again, similar virtual thing. Here, compare themes and meanings between two works. Imagery can create mood, blah, 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 blah. As an adult, I don't care about this. Kids don't care about this. It's just meaningless, exercises. The kind of dialogue that resulted in, Alana comparing C.S. Lewis and the Roald Dahl is because it's real. She's having conversations with real human beings, and she becomes articulate and thoughtful. We'll do one more quickly. This is from another one. Forget what this one is called, but I'll play just a little bit of video. You can see persuasion, rhetoric, and so forth. Here we've got a teacher talking.
Students were grouped in interest by superhero. They had a choice between 6, and they were given some time to work together. They also had the option to work alone if they so choose.
So, here you've got a teacher teaching you. For those of you who remember school, that's what school was. Here it's a virtual version. Later you see her actually teaching. But again, for me, as a learner, as an adult, I could not sit through this stuff. Whereas a conversation like I had with Lana, or a conversation like the one in the Bill of the Rights that Viggo Mortensen was having with his children, or the conversations I've had with thousands of kids, they love it, they're excited, they're engaged, real human interaction. Eventually I get students to the point where they can learn how to argue with each other. And as a consequence, they love learning, they love thinking, talking, arguing. They become really good at reading difficult material because gradually we integrate the reading of difficult material into participation in the conversations. With additional training, they become great at essay writing because we're arguing back and forth, and instead of an English teacher giving us an assignment, they've got their peers that they're going to argue with. And ultimately, if you think of, say, the powers needed to be part of a startup team in contemporary, 21st century culture, whether you're a coder, UX, UI designer, video developer, digital marketer, accountant, whatever, the kind of interaction we have in teams that are really creating the 21st century economy, people thinking, talking, arguing back and forth, that kind of real world experience, becoming articulate, thoughtful, and engaged, is so much more powerful than these canned lessons. And so as a consequence, I'd love to have a much broader conversation on what schooling is, what schooling should be, what leads to successful adult performance, what leads to social mobility. Quickly, and I'll stop this one. My mother was a high school dropout. My father was an elevator repairman. I did not have educated parents, but my father talked to me a lot about ideas. He tried to explain to me electronics when I was young. And I became a reader later on. And I think both talking about ideas and reading gave me much more power as a reader, thinker, listener, speaker than any of the English assignments. I hated English class in school. It seemed like the most boring and meaningless crap ever. So with all due respect to the English teachers that are stuck in schools teaching this stuff, and many of them would prefer to have engaged intellectual dialogue with their students, I want people to really think about what is going to lead to successful adult performance, what's going to lead to successful student engagement, what's going to lead to vibrant learning in the humanities, language arts, history, social studies, anthropology, psychology, philosophy, literature, etc. How do we get people really vibrantly learning and becoming prepared to be articulate members of business meetings in the 21st century? Let's have a conversation about that. Thank you. Michael Strong, founder of ExpanseOnline.co and the author of The Habit of Thought. Bye-bye.